The rain doesn't care who you are. It falls on the rich and the broken exactly the same way, cold, indifferent, relentless. Mara Calloway learned that truth on a Tuesday night in October, sitting beneath the rusted overhang of a closed laundromat on the edge of Harlan, Kentucky, with $37 in her pocket. A garbage bag holding everything she owned, and the particular kind of hunger that lives not just in your stomach but somewhere deeper, behind your ribs. Pressing against the place where hope used to be. She was 20 years old. She had a cut above her left eyebrow that hadn't fully healed. She had a sociology textbook she'd stolen from a donation bin because she liked the weight of it, liked holding something that felt like a future, even if the future wasn't hers anymore. And she had a folded yellow flyer that a man at the county food pantry had pressed into her hand that afternoon, muttering something about an estate auction happening the next morning. 20 minutes up the mountain road. She didn't know why she kept the flyer. Maybe it was the word on it that caught her eye, Distillery, a word that felt old and strange and somehow like a secret. Maybe it was the starting bid printed at the bottom, $10. Or maybe it was simply that she had nowhere else to go. And sometimes the only thing standing between a person and complete disappearance is one piece of paper that makes you curious enough to stay alive through the night. Harlan County had a particular way of holding on to people. Not gently, more like the way old mud holds a boot. The harder you pull, the deeper you sink. Mara had been trying to leave for most of her life, but leaving required resources she'd never had, and resources required stability she could never seem to build. And stability required something she'd run out of completely the year her mother died, which was confidence that the ground beneath her feet would stay solid. Her mother, Dina, had died in February. Not dramatically. Not from addiction or violence, the way people who didn't know Harlan expected. Dina died from a blood infection that started in her gums because she hadn't been to a dentist in 11 years because she couldn't afford it. A tooth. Her mother died from a tooth. Mara had been in the middle of her second semester at the community college in Middlesbrough when it happened. Commuting 2 hours each way on a borrowed car that blew its engine 3 weeks after the funeral. After that, the dominoes fell in the quiet, invisible way that dominoes fall for poor people, silently, quickly, and without any news coverage. The apartment her mother had rented was in Dina's name. Mara had 30 days. She called every cousin she knew. 2 didn't pick up. 1 told her she could sleep on his couch but made it clear what that would eventually cost her. She didn't go. She tried the shelter in Pineville. Full. Tried the one in Harlan. Full except for Tuesday nights, when they had space, but it was Thursday. She took a job at a gas station and slept in the storage room for 2 weeks until the manager caught her and, to his credit, looked genuinely sorry before he told her she had to go. By October, she'd been effectively homeless for 5 months. Not in the dramatic cinematic sense, she hadn't been on the streets every night. She'd cycled through bad couches, church basements, a woman from the pantry who let her stay for 6 days before her husband objected. She'd learned to carry her life lightly. To not unpack. To sleep with one eye half open and her shoes on. What homelessness actually feels like, she would later try to explain to people, is not cold or hunger or danger, though it is all of those things. What it actually feels like is illegitimacy. Like you've been quietly removed from the list of people who are allowed to exist in the normal world. You can't get a job without an address. You can't get an address without a job. You can't open a bank account without ID, and your ID is in a storage unit you can no longer access because you missed the payment. Everything is a closed door that requires a key that's behind a different closed door. She sat under the laundromat awning that Tuesday night and read the flyer 3 times. Harlan County Estate Auction, Saturday, October 14th, Calloway Mountain Road. Calloway. Her last name. She didn't think it meant anything. She told herself it was a coincidence. But she folded the flyer carefully, like it was something fragile, and she put it in the front pocket of her jacket, and in the morning she started walking. The auction was not what she expected. She'd imagined something bustling, dealers with clipboards, antique hunters with knowing eyes, maybe a crowd gathered around beautiful old furniture. What she found instead, after a 40-minute walk up a road that climbed the mountain in switchbacks through fog and yellow-leafed hardwoods, was a farmstead that looked like it had been slowly exhaling for 40 years. A low white house with a sagging porch. A barn with half its tin roof peeled back. And behind the barn, connected to it by a covered wooden walkway, a building she almost missed entirely. It was maybe 30 feet long and 20 wide, built from old stone and rough timber. The door was padlocked. A handwritten tag on the door said, Lot 7, Copper Still and Associated Equipment, ASIS, $10 starting bid. There were maybe 15 people at the auction. Most of them were interested in the house contents, old furniture, farm tools, a working tractor that went for $4,000. Nobody else seemed particularly interested in Lot 7. A man in a canvas jacket, the auctioneer, she assumed, told her the building had belonged to a woman named Cecilia Harps, who had died at 91 in August without living relatives. The county had taken the property for back taxes. The contents were being liquidated. What's in there? Mara asked. Old distilling equipment, he said. Copper pot still, some barrels, lot of old records and tools. Been locked up 30 years at least. Last we checked, the equipment's intact but who knows what condition. What did she make? He looked at her with a mild sort of amusement. Apple brandy, supposedly. Her family had been making it up here since the 1800s. But it's been a legal operation, technically, though nobody ever bothered Cecilia about it. She was 100 years old, more or less. 91, Mara corrected. He smiled. Right. Mara had $37. She bid 10 on Lot 7. Nobody else bid. The auctioneer looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, like he was trying to decide something about her, and then brought his gavel down. Sold. She stood there holding a receipt and a padlock key, her hands slightly trembling, not entirely sure what she'd just done. She'd spent a quarter of her money on a building she couldn't live in, containing equipment she didn't know how to use, that had belonged to a dead woman she'd never heard of. But she had a key. And she had a door. And when she unlocked that door and pushed it open and the smell hit her, copper and char and something sweet and ancient. Like the ghost of 1,000 fermentations, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she was supposed to be somewhere. The first night, she slept on the floor of the distillery. Not symbolically, literally. She swept a corner clean, laid down her jacket, and slept on the stone floor with the garbage bag of her belongings as a pillow. Listening to the mountain wind move through the gaps in the timber walls. It wasn't comfortable. But it was hers. Technically, legally hers, for $10, and that fact felt enormous. In the morning she inventoried what she had. The copper pot still was extraordinary, she didn't know that then, but she could tell it was old and serious and carefully made. It stood about 4 feet high, its curves green-brown with oxidation but structurally sound, connected to a worm coil that descended into a wooden barrel that had long since dried out. On shelves along the back wall, glass carboys, copper funnels, an old saccharometer still in its leather case, hand-forged tools she couldn't name. And then, behind the still, tucked into the gap between the still's body and the stone wall, as if it had been deliberately hidden, a wooden box. She didn't open it that first morning. She noticed it, registered it, and left it alone. She had more urgent problems. She had no food. She had no water except what came from a cistern outside that she wasn't sure was clean. She had no phone because her phone had been cut off 6 weeks ago. She spent the first week surviving in the most basic sense of the word. She walked down the mountain to the pantry every 2 days. She found that one of Cecilia's neighbors, an elderly man named Odell Price, who lived a quarter-mile down the road, would let her fill water jugs at his spigot in exchange for helping him stack firewood. He didn't ask many questions. She didn't offer many answers. She started reading. The distillery had books, actual books, not records. A shelf of them near the back, some so old the spines had disintegrated. The Art of Distillation by John French, a reprint from who knows when. A spiral-bound notebook titled, in cramped handwriting, Cecilia's Process, Not for Sharing. A faded pamphlet from something called the American Distilling Institute. She read everything. She read by daylight and by a battery lantern she found in the barn and managed to charge at Odell's house. She didn't understand most of it at first. Distillation is chemistry, it is yeast and sugar and temperature and time and pressure and patience. She had never taken a chemistry class. She had a half-completed sociology degree and a background in survival and absolutely zero technical knowledge. She failed spectacularly and repeatedly. The first wash she attempted, a simple apple mash. Using apples she'd gathered from an overgrown orchard on the property, went sour before it finished fermenting because she didn't understand temperature control and the nights were cold. She threw it out and started again. The second batch fermented correctly, but she ran the still too hot and the distillate came out harsh and nearly undrinkable. She could tell because she tried a small amount and it burned wrong. Chemical and raw. She cried that night. Genuinely, deeply cried, sitting on the floor next to the still with her back against the warm copper, ugly crying, the kind that comes from exhaustion accumulated over months. Not just about the failed batch. About everything. About her mother. About the tooth. About the college she'd had to leave. About what she might have been if the ground had ever stayed solid under her. She let herself cry for a long time. Then she went back to Cecilia's notebook and read it again more carefully. The third batch was better. Not good, but better. The fourth started to approach something she might call drinkable. By the time winter arrived, she had produced 12 bottles of rough apple brandy. She'd used apples that cost her nothing. She'd used equipment that cost her $10. She had 0 permits, 0 legal standing, 0 ability to sell a single bottle. But she understood something now that she hadn't when she started. She understood what she was building. Not bottles. Knowledge. Every failed batch was teaching her the language of the process. Temperature, timing, the sound the still made when the pressure was right, the way the distillate ran clear or cloudy, the difference between heads and hearts and tails in the flow. She was learning to speak something. And then, one cold January evening, she finally opened the wooden box. She'd been avoiding it, she realized. Not consciously. But there'd been something about it that felt like opening it too soon would ruin something. Like finding the end of a book before you were ready for it. The box was cedar. Small, about the size of a shoebox. The latch was brass and stiff but not locked. Inside, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, a small leather journal, 2 photographs, and a folded document that turned out to be a deed. The photographs stopped her. One was old, daguerreotype old, or close to it, showing a woman standing next to a copper still that looked nearly identical to the one Mara was standing beside. The woman was young. Maybe 22 or 23. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that Mara recognized instinctively and with a kind of shock. It was the look of someone who has decided to stop being afraid. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, Eleanor Calloway, 1891. Calloway. Mara's hands went still. The second photograph was more recent, 1960s, maybe, based on the color and the clothes. A woman in her 40s standing with a teenage girl outside the exact building Mara was sitting in. Both of them were smiling. On the back, Cecilia and her apprentice, 1967. The journal was Cecilia's. Mara read it over 3 nights, careful with the brittle pages. The story it contained was this: Eleanor Calloway had been a free black woman from Harlan County who had built the distillery in 1889. Having learned distillation from a family in Virginia before the war. She'd made apple brandy that was, by all accounts in Cecilia's telling of it, extraordinary, sought after across 3 counties. She'd never been able to operate legally because the laws of the time made it essentially impossible for her to hold a license. She operated quietly, protected somewhat by her remoteness and by neighbors who respected her. Eleanor had died in 1923. She had no surviving children. But she'd left the distillery and its equipment to a woman who had worked with her, a woman named Lottie Harps, who was Cecilia's grandmother. And here was the line in Cecilia's journal that made Mara stop breathing for a moment: Grandma Lottie always said Eleanor didn't just leave us the copper and the oak. She left us the responsibility. That the brandy was a story, and as long as we kept making it, the story stayed alive. When I'm gone, I hope it finds someone who understands that. Mara sat for a long time. She thought about the word Calloway on the flyer. She thought about her last name, which she'd always known was her mother's name, and before that her grandmother's, and before that she'd never thought to look. She opened the folded document, the deed. It was original, handwritten, dated 1889. The property granted to Eleanor Calloway, signed by the county registrar. Eleanor Calloway. Mara didn't know yet. She wasn't certain. The connection might have been coincidence. Calloway is not an uncommon name in eastern Kentucky. But it might not have been. And sitting on the stone floor of a 130-year-old distillery in the middle of a Kentucky winter, holding a photograph of a woman with her last name who had stood beside this same copper still when she was around the same age Mara was now. Mara felt something shift in the architecture of who she was. Not luck. Not magic. Something older than both of those. She looked up at the still. The copper was warm from the day's work, the light from her lantern making it glow amber and red. It looked exactly like it had in Eleanor's photograph. She had been learning to speak a language. She was only now beginning to understand it was her own. Spring arrived and Mara stopped thinking of herself as homeless. She'd insulated 2 corners of the distillery with salvaged materials, built a sleeping area, rigged a water collection system from the cistern with Odell's help. It wasn't a house. But it was a place she was building rather than escaping, and that distinction made it feel like something entirely different. She filed for a free legal consultation at a clinic in Harlan and spent 3 Saturdays in a row learning about the legal framework for craft distilling in Kentucky, which had been overhauled in recent years and was now, she discovered, actually one of the more accessible frameworks for small producers. A microdistillery license was within reach if she could meet the requirements. The requirements were significant. But they were not impossible. She applied for a small business grant through a rural economic development program she found through the clinic. She was rejected the first time. She rewrote the application, this time including Eleanor Calloway's history and the archival significance of the distillery itself. She'd begun to research Eleanor more carefully. Finding references in county historical records, in an old newspaper column from 1912 that mentioned the Calloway woman on the mountain and her brandy. The second application was more than a business pitch. It was a story. It was approved. $11,000. She wept again. Different kind of weeping. She used the money precisely and slowly. Repaired the still's worm coil with the help of a coppersmith she found in Lexington who drove out to assess it and stayed for 4 hours because, as he said, he'd never seen one like it outside of a museum. Replaced the fermentation vessels. Had the building assessed for structural integrity. Opened a business bank account, which required an address, and she used the distillery's address, which was legal because she'd filed it as a business premises. She enrolled in an online course in small business accounting. She spent money on this carefully, the way someone spends money when they remember what it felt like to have none. She was not the same person who had walked up that mountain road in October. But it wasn't the money that had changed her, the money was almost beside the point. What had changed her was the year of learning. The failed batches. The cold nights on the stone floor. The reading by lantern light. The choosing, every single morning, to stay and try again rather than retreat. She'd developed a discipline she hadn't known she was capable of. Not because someone told her to be disciplined, because she'd learned through direct experience that the only variable she could actually control was how carefully she paid attention. To the temperature. To the process. To the history she was now accountable to. She produced her first commercially intended batch in July, 140 bottles of apple brandy made from heirloom apple varieties she'd tracked down through a heritage orchards organization in Virginia. She labeled them by hand. Eleanor's Reserve. Harlan County Apple Brandy. EST 1889. She didn't put her own name on the label yet. She wasn't ready for that. The label felt like it belonged to the story first. She sold the first 60 bottles at a regional craft spirits competition. She hadn't entered competitively, just set up at the trade portion of the event. She was 21 years old and she'd driven there in a truck she'd bought for $800, and she sat behind her table in the only nice shirt she owned and she poured samples for strangers. The response was not what she expected. It wasn't polite interest. It was genuine astonishment. Not because the brandy was perfect, it wasn't, not yet, but because it tasted like something. Like somewhere. Like time and stone and mountain air and patient work. A buyer from a specialty spirits retailer in Louisville tried it, set down his glass, and said, "Where has this been?" She smiled. 130 years, she said. Give or take. 8 months later, a historian contacted her. Her name was Dr. Patricia Osei, from the University of Kentucky's Appalachian Studies program. She'd heard about Eleanor Calloway's distillery through a network of researchers working on Black history in the region, a subject that was underrepresented and under-resourced. She explained carefully, because the people who kept those histories had generally been people without the power to make institutions listen. Dr. Osei came to the distillery on a Thursday in March. She was precise and warm and carried a leather notebook, and she spent 40 minutes looking at everything before she said very much at all. Then she sat down at the work table and she told Mara something. Eleanor Calloway's history was not, in fact, unknown. She appeared in several documents held by a private archive in Lexington, letters, a contract. A formal complaint filed by a neighboring distiller who'd tried to have her operation shut down in 1904 and failed. The private archive had been sitting on these documents for decades, she said, because the family that owned the archive hadn't prioritized them. Eleanor wasn't just a bootlegger or a small producer, Dr. Osei said carefully. Based on what we're finding, her operation was substantial for its time. She employed 6 people at its peak. She had established distribution relationships across multiple counties through intermediaries. And, she paused here, watching Mara's face, there's a legal record from 1906 of her applying for a formal distilling license, which was denied. On grounds that are not defensible by any modern standard. Mara was quiet. She knew what she was building, Dr. Osei continued. The equipment she chose, the way she structured things, she was trying to build something that would last. And then the doors were closed to her. Not because of what she made. Because of who she was. Mara looked at the copper still. She'd been thinking of Eleanor's story as inspiring. As a kind of gift passed through time. But she was now understanding it differently, as an injustice that had been waiting 100 years for someone to name it properly. Eleanor Calloway had built something remarkable and the world had spent a century refusing to acknowledge it. And now Mara, who hadn't known any of this when she walked up that mountain road, who had simply been a cold, hungry 20-year-old looking for somewhere to sleep, was standing in Eleanor's building, with Eleanor's still, continuing Eleanor's work. She thought about her own mother. About the tooth. About all the ordinary, structural, grinding ways that the world forecloses on people, not through dramatic villainy but through quiet bureaucratic indifference. She thought about the flyer. Calloway Mountain Road. Her own last name. The $10 bid. The wooden box behind the still. She had wondered, occasionally, whether it was all coincidence. She wondered it less now. "I want to find out if Eleanor and I are actually connected," Mara said. "By blood, I mean." "We can try," Dr. Osei said. "Historical genealogy in this region is difficult. Records were kept inconsistently for certain communities. But we can try." They did try. It took 4 months and the help of 2 genealogists and a database of Freedmen's Bureau records. What they found was not a clean direct line, history rarely offers those. But they found evidence that was compelling and that Dr. Osei, in her professional assessment, called strongly indicative. Mara's great-great-grandmother, on her mother's side, had been a woman who'd moved from Harlan County to Middlesbrough in the early 1900s. A woman named Clara. And Clara had a sister who had stayed in Harlan County. A sister whose married name had been Calloway. Not proof. Not certainty. But enough. Enough that Mara stood in the distillery the night she got the findings and put her hand on the copper still and understood what had actually happened. She hadn't found the distillery. Not exactly. Something, call it ancestry, call it gravity, call it the way lost things sometimes find their way back, something had delivered her to the place she was always supposed to be. She was not a homeless girl who had stumbled into an opportunity. She was the continuation of a story that had been interrupted. She went home that night, home, the word fitting now without irony, and she sat down and she redesigned the label. Eleanor's Reserve. Harlan County Apple Brandy. EST 1889. Restored 2023. And beneath the name, in small print, she added a line she'd been thinking about for weeks, made by the people who were always here. The distillery is still standing on Calloway Mountain Road. If you drive up on the right day, you might smell the apple mash before you see the building, sweet and alive and complicated, a smell that belongs to no particular century. You might see the copper still visible through the window, glowing in whatever light is hitting it, and if you've seen old photographs you'll notice it looks the same as it did in 1891. Mara Calloway runs it alone, mostly, though she has one part-time employee now and is training a second. She is 23. She still sleeps in the distillery sometimes. Not because she has to but because she likes the sound of the mountain at night and the smell of the fermentation and the way the copper holds warmth long after the fire is out. She has been offered money, real money, from investors who want to scale the brand, put it in airports, make it into something national. She has declined so far. Not because she's naive about money or opposed to growth, but because she's learned something that people who've never been truly hungry often struggle to understand. The why of something is more fragile than it looks, and once you trade it for speed, you don't always get it back. Eleanor Calloway spent her life building something extraordinary and the world took more than a century to acknowledge it. Mara has decided that what she owes Eleanor, what she owes her mother, what she owes that cold October night under the laundromat awning, is not impressive growth. It is continuity. It is showing up every day and doing the work with the same attention and patience that the copper still has always required. She found out recently that the County Historical Society wants to designate the distillery as a heritage site. She is in the process of agreeing to this. She wants Eleanor's name on a plaque that people can see from the road. The thing Mara thinks about most, when she's alone in the building at the end of a working day, is not where she came from or even where she's going. It's the moment she opened that wooden box and found Eleanor's photograph, that young woman looking at the camera with the face of someone who had decided to stop being afraid. She keeps a copy of that photograph above the still now. Not as a decoration. As a responsibility. Because here is what she finally understood, sitting on that stone floor in January with the journal in her hands and the mountain wind pressing against the old timber walls. Every person who was ever told they didn't belong somewhere, every person who was denied the license or the door or the chance, they didn't just disappear. They kept building. They built quietly, without recognition, without permission, and they hid what they made behind copper stills and in wooden boxes and in the hands of people who came after them. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you follow a $10 flyer up a mountain road on a night when you have nothing left to lose, sometimes you find it. Sometimes you find them. And when you do, you don't get to just take it. You get to carry it. So here is the question Mara's story leaves behind, not just for her but for all of us. If someone before you was building something in the dark, building it for you. Without knowing your name, how would you even know? And if you found it, would you have the courage to finish what they started? The copper still is still warm. The story isn't over.